On a Tuesday morning in March of 1987, Delmar Huber stood in the gravel lot behind his shop in Stafford County, Kansas, and watched the last truck from the Midland casting plant roll past on the county road without stopping. It didn't slow down. It didn't turn in. The driver didn't even glance toward the building with the hand-painted sign that said, Huber Machine and Repair EST, 1961. The truck just kept going. Its flatbed loaded with equipment Delmar recognized: a boring mill, a surface grinder, 2 engine lathes still bolted to their mounting plates. All of it headed somewhere else. Somewhere that wasn't Stafford County. Somewhere that had decided Stafford County was finished. Delmar was 58 years old that morning. He had operated his machine shop for 26 years. He had 3 employees, a Bridgeport mill, a lathe his father had bought in 1948, and a reputation that extended to every county within 100 miles. Not because he advertised, because he never advertised, but because when something broke and nobody else could fix it, people found their way to the gravel lot behind the building on Route 50. He had rebuilt crankshafts. He had fabricated replacement parts for equipment the manufacturer no longer supported. He had saved harvests by working through the night on a combine head that a farmer needed back in the field by dawn. He had done all of this quietly, without ceremony, and for prices that reflected what people in Stafford County could actually pay, rather than what the market would bear. He watched that truck until it disappeared past the tree line. Then he went back inside and started work on a cracked manifold someone had dropped off the previous afternoon. Let me tell you about Stafford County in 1987, because you need to understand the place before you can understand what happened there over the next 15 years. Stafford County sits in the south-central part of Kansas, flat country, wheat country. The kind of landscape that looks simple from a car window and reveals its complexity only to people who work it. The county had a population of around 6,000 people at the time, spread across the city of St. John and a handful of smaller towns, Seward, Maxville, Zenith, and several hundred farms ranging from a few hundred acres to several thousand. The economy ran on grain, cattle, oil, and the services that supported those 3 things: machine shops, implement dealers, welding outfits, parts suppliers. The kind of infrastructure that doesn't make headlines but without which nothing else functions. The Midland casting plant had been the county's largest employer outside of agriculture for 22 years. It made gray iron castings, manifolds, housings, brackets, pump bodies, for agricultural equipment manufacturers in the oilfield service industry. At its peak, it employed 140 people. When it closed in the spring of 1987, it employed 61. The closure was announced in February and completed by April. The official reason given was consolidation of manufacturing operations. The real reason, which everyone in St. John understood, was that a facility in Mexico had been brought online the previous year at a fraction of the operating cost, and the math was not complicated. The plant left behind an empty building, a contaminated retention pond that would take 15 years to remediate, and a county that had just lost its second-largest payroll in a single quarter. What the plant also left behind, though nobody thought of it this way at the time, was a problem. The agricultural equipment in Stafford County, the tractors, the combines, the irrigation pump engines, the grain auger drives, had been built over a period of 40 years, and a significant portion of it used cast iron components that were no longer in production. When those components cracked, as cast iron eventually does, the standard solution had been to order a replacement casting from a supplier, have it machined to spec, and install it. That supply chain had never been simple, but it had existed. Now, with Midland gone and the nearest remaining foundry 200 miles away in Wichita, the supply chain for agricultural castings in Stafford County became something between difficult and impossible. Replacement parts that had cost $60 now cost $300 if you could find them. Lead times stretched from days to months, and for older equipment, anything pre-1970, replacement castings often simply didn't exist anymore. The manufacturer had discontinued them. The pattern had been destroyed. The part was, by the official definition of the industry, unobtainable. Delmar Huber had understood this was coming before the closure was announced. He had been watching the plant's order book thin out for 3 years. He had been watching the implement dealers start hedging their parts inventories, and he had been doing something about it quietly, in the way that Delmar did most things. Let me tell you about what Delmar had been building in the back section of his shop, because it's the reason this story exists, and it's the reason people in Stafford County still talk about him 30 years later. Behind the main machine shop floor, separated by a cinder block wall with a steel door, was a room that Delmar's employees called the foundry, though calling it that was, in 1987, still a matter of some optimism. What it contained was a small crucible furnace that Delmar had built himself from a salvaged electric kiln body and a commercial burner assembly. A sand muller he had bought at auction from a closed pottery supply company in Hutchinson for $40. A flask rack made from angle iron he had welded himself, and approximately 2,000 pounds of casting sand in 50-pound paper bags stacked against the north wall. There was also a pattern library. Wooden patterns, aluminum patterns, a few made from automotive body filler over carved foam, stored on shelves that Delmar had built from lumber he'd milled himself from a cottonwood that had come down in a windstorm on his property in 1983. He had started building this room in 1984. He had told no one why, or rather, he had told people who asked that he was interested in doing some casting work, which was true, but incomplete. What he was actually doing was preparing for what he could see coming. He had grown up watching his father repair equipment during years when new parts were unobtainable, during the war and after it, when a farmer who needed a casting either made one or did without. His father had done sand casting in a converted chicken coop using a coal-fired furnace and patterns carved from pine. Delmar had watched him do it as a boy and had helped him do it as a teenager and had understood, in the way that some people understand things without being able to articulate them, that this knowledge was not obsolete simply because conditions had temporarily made it unnecessary. Conditions had a way of changing. By March of 1987, when the last Midland truck rolled past without stopping, Delmar had cast approximately 60 parts in his back room. Most of them were experimental. He had been learning the process, refining his sand mixtures, calibrating his furnace temperatures, building patterns for components he expected to need. He had not yet cast a part for a paying customer. He had told almost nobody the room existed. His 3 employees knew about it, and they were, without exception, skeptical. His wife Norma knew about it and was, without exception, supportive, in the quiet way that Norma supported everything Delmar did, which was to say, she asked good questions and then got out of his way. The first paying customer came in April of 1987, 3 weeks after the plant closed. His name was Arnie Sorensen, and he farmed 1,800 acres of wheat in Milo, north of Maxville, and he had a cracked exhaust manifold on a 1964 Oliver 1,800 tractor that he needed in the field by the first week of May. The manifold had cracked along the number 3 port flange, a common failure point on that casting, and the replacement part had been discontinued by the manufacturer in 1979. Arnie had called 3 suppliers. He had called the implement dealer in St. John. He had called a salvage yard in Pratt. Nobody had one. The salvage yard told him they might be able to find one in 60 to 90 days. Arnie needed the tractor in 5 weeks. He drove to Delmar's shop because someone had told him Delmar might be able to help, though the person who told him this was not entirely sure what they meant by that. Delmar looked at the manifold for about 2 minutes. He measured the crack with a caliper. He looked at the casting marks on the underside and wrote down the part number in a small notebook he kept in his shirt pocket. Then he told Arnie he would call him in 2 days. What happened in those 2 days is worth describing, because it illustrates something about how Delmar worked that the rest of this story depends on. He did not call a supplier. He did not search for a salvage part. He went to his pattern library and looked for the closest existing pattern he had to the Oliver manifold geometry. He found one, a pattern he had made 2 years earlier from measurements he had taken off an identical manifold that a neighbor had thrown in a scrap pile. He had made the pattern on a Sunday afternoon because the manifold had interested him, because its port geometry was unusual, because he had thought at the time that he might need it someday. He had not known when. He had just made the pattern and put it on the shelf. He spent the 2 days doing test pours. He adjusted his sand mixture. He modified the gating system on the pattern to improve metal flow through the port passages. He poured 3 test castings, none of which were right, and then a 4th that was. On the morning of the 3rd day, he called Arnie Sorensen and told him the part would be ready in a week. Arnie asked how much. Delmar told him $85. Arnie was quiet for a moment and then said he'd expected it to be more. Delmar said the price was $85. Arnie picked up the manifold 9 days later. It was machined to spec, pressure tested, and painted the same shade of Oliver green as the original. Arnie installed it that afternoon. The tractor went to the field on schedule. Let me tell you about what happened after that, because the story doesn't end with one manifold. Word moves through a farming community the way water moves through flat ground. Slowly at first, finding the low channels, then faster as the channels fill. Arnie Sorensen told his neighbor, Chet Lindgren, about the manifold. Chet Lindgren told his brother-in-law who farmed in Pratt County. The implement dealer in St. John, a man named Wade Prescott, who had been selling John Deere equipment in the county for 19 years, heard the story at the co-op and dismissed it. He was not unkind about it. He simply said, with the confidence of a man who has sold a great deal of equipment and therefore believes he understands the equipment business completely, that what Delmar was describing was not a viable solution. Cast iron manifolds required precise metallurgical control, he said. The iron had to be the right grade. The coolant had to be controlled. You couldn't just pour iron in a back room and expect it to hold up under thermal cycling. He had said some version of this to 3 or 4 people by the time it got back to Delmar, and Delmar, who had heard it, said nothing in response. He went back to his shop and kept working. The second customer came in May. The 3rd and 4th came in June. By the end of the summer of 1987, Delmar had cast and machined 23 parts for paying customers: manifolds, pump housings, gear covers, a differential case for a 1958 Farmhouse 4.5 that nobody had believed could be repaired. Every part had been installed. None had failed. The prices ranged from $40 for a small bracket casting to $220 for the differential case, which had taken 3 pattern iterations and a week of work. Every customer had paid without complaint, because the alternative was a part that didn't exist or a tractor that didn't run. Wade Prescott heard about the differential case at the co-op and said it wouldn't last a season. He said this with the same confidence he had said the first thing, and with the same absence of any particular evidence. He was not a malicious man. He was a man who had built his professional identity around a supply chain, and the suggestion that the supply chain could be bypassed by a machinist with a homemade furnace in a cinder block room was not a suggestion he was equipped to take seriously. It threatened something. Not his business exactly, because Delmar wasn't selling tractors. It threatened his understanding of how things worked, which is sometimes harder to give up than the business itself. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched someone dismiss an idea, not because they'd examined it and found it wanting, but because examining it carefully would require them to revise something they'd spent 20 years being certain about? That's what Wade Prescott was doing in the fall of 1987. He wasn't lying. He wasn't being deliberately unfair. He was protecting a mental model of the world that had served him well, and the model said that parts came from manufacturers and distributors and dealers, not from a machinist's back room, and anything that suggested otherwise was either naive or wrong. The laugh, and there was a laugh, a specific laugh at the co-op counter in October of 1987, when someone mentioned that Delmar had cast a water pump housing for a 1961 Minneapolis Moline. That laugh was not contempt. It was the sound of a man refusing to update his model. Delmar was not at the co-op when it happened. He heard about it from Norma, who had heard it from the woman who ran the feed store, who had been at the co-op counter when it occurred. Delmar listened to Norma's account of it at the kitchen table that evening and then finished his coffee and said he had some patterns to work on and went back to the shop. He did not appear to be angry. He did not appear to be wounded. He appeared to be a man who had something to do and intended to do it, and who found the opinions of people who hadn't examined his work to be roughly as relevant as the weather in a county he'd never visited. Let me tell you about the pattern library, because it became the center of everything that followed and because most people who came to understand what Delmar had built didn't understand it until they saw the library. By the end of 1988, Delmar had patterns for 340 distinct cast iron parts on those shelves. By the end of 1990, he had 612. By 1995, he had over 1,000. The patterns came from several sources. Some he made himself from measurements taken off original parts, cracked parts that customers brought in, worn parts that farmers were throwing away, parts he found at farm auctions and salvage yards and bought for $1 or $2 because nobody else wanted them. Some came from technical drawings. He had spent years accumulating manufacturer service manuals and engineering drawings from dealerships that were closing, from estates, from farmers who had kept the paperwork for equipment they'd run for decades. Some came from other machinists, men who were retiring or closing their shops and who, when they heard what Delmar was doing, drove to Stafford County and donated their pattern collections to him rather than see them destroyed. A retired foundry pattern maker from Hutchinson named Elmer Borgman brought him 400 patterns in the back of a pickup truck in 1991 and spent 2 days helping Delmar catalog them. Elmer was 74 years old and had been making patterns since 1938, and he told Delmar, standing in the back room, looking at the shelves, that he had been afraid this knowledge was going to disappear. He seemed relieved that it wasn't. The work was not glamorous. Making a pattern for a cast iron part is painstaking, slow, detail-oriented work. You have to account for shrinkage. Iron contracts as it cools, so the pattern must be slightly larger than the finished part, typically about 1/8 inch per foot depending on the alloy. You have to account for draft, the slight taper on vertical surfaces that allows the pattern to be withdrawn from the sand without disturbing the mold. You have to design the gating system, the channels through which the molten iron flows into the mold cavity, so that the metal fills completely before it begins to solidify, and so that turbulence is minimized, and so that the shrinkage void forms in the gating rather than in the part. Delmar had learned most of this from books. He had a shelf of foundry texts, some of them decades old, a few of them in German, which he could not read but which had diagrams he could follow, and from experimentation, and from Elmer Borgman's 2-day tutorial, and from the accumulated experience of pouring iron in a cinder block room for years, until the failures taught him what the books hadn't. He kept records. This is important. He kept a logbook for every pour, the date, the pattern number, the iron charge weight, the furnace temperature at pour, the sand mixture, the results, the defects if any, the corrective action taken. By 1992, the logbooks filled a shelf of their own. They were written in Delmar's small, precise handwriting, the handwriting of a machinist who had spent his life making measurements and recording them, and they constituted something that had no official name, but that was, in practical terms, a complete technical record of how to reproduce cast iron agricultural parts under field conditions with limited equipment. Nobody had asked him to keep these records. Nobody had suggested they would be valuable. He kept them because he was Delmar Huber, and Delmar Huber kept records of things he did, because that was what a serious person did when they were learning something that mattered. Let me tell you about the years between 1988 and 1993, because they were the years when the scope of what Delmar had built became clear to everyone except the people who most needed to understand it. The farm economy in south-central Kansas during those years was not good. It was not the catastrophe of the mid-1980s, the foreclosure years, the years when farm families who had worked the same ground for 3 generations lost it to banks that had no interest in farming and every interest in recovering their capital. But it was not recovery either. It was the aftermath of catastrophe, which in some ways is harder than the catastrophe itself, because the catastrophe at least has a clarity to it. The aftermath is just grinding. Commodity prices stayed low, input costs stayed high, equipment that should have been replaced wasn't replaced because the money wasn't there. Farmers ran machines longer than they should have, deferred maintenance that couldn't really be deferred, and eventually brought Delmar parts that had been failing slowly for years and had finally failed completely. The volume of work coming into the back room doubled between 1988 and 1990. It doubled again between 1990 and 1993. Delmar hired a second machinist, a young man named Gary Hassel, who had grown up on a farm outside Seward and had taken machining courses at the vocational school in Pratt, and trained him in the foundry work. Gary was skeptical at first, in the way that young men who have been formally trained in a trade are often skeptical of methods that weren't covered in their training. But he was also honest, and within a year he had revised his skepticism into something closer to admiration. He told Delmar once that he hadn't understood, before he started working in the back room, that a person could know that much about iron. Delmar said he didn't know that much about iron. He said he just paid attention to what the iron was telling him, and most people didn't bother to listen. Wade Prescott heard, in the spring of 1990, that Delmar had cast a replacement crankcase, half for a 1955 Oliver Super 88 that a farmer in Reno County had been trying to source for 2 years. The crankcase half was a large, complex casting, thin walls, multiple chord passages, close dimensional tolerances. the kind of part that even professional foundries approached carefully. Wade heard about it at the co-op and said nothing. His smile was present, but it had gotten smaller. He had been saying for 3 years that Delmar's parts wouldn't hold up, and the parts were holding up, and the accumulation of that evidence was doing something to the certainty he had carried into those co-op conversations. He didn't acknowledge it. He didn't revise his public position. But the laugh that had been so easy in October of 1987 was no longer available to him, and the people at the co-op counter noticed its absence, even if they didn't remark on it. Let me tell you about the summer of 1993, because that was when everything changed, and not in the way anyone had predicted. The summer of 1993 was the summer of the Great Flood. Most people associate the 1993 flood with the Missouri and Mississippi River basins. Iowa, Missouri, Illinois, the Great River valleys, and that's where the worst damage was. But the flooding extended into Kansas in ways that don't get discussed as much, and in Stafford County it came not from a river but from the ground itself. June and July of 1993 were the wettest months the county had recorded since 1951. Fields that had never flooded in living memory were under water for weeks. The wheat crop, which was already in by June, survived. But the summer crops, milo, corn, soybeans, were devastated. Farmers who had been running their equipment hard in dry years found themselves suddenly unable to work their ground, and when the water receded and they could get back in, they found that the extended wet period had done things to their machinery that dry storage never would have. Rust, seized components, cracked castings from freeze-thaw cycles in parts of the county that had gotten cold snaps in late May before the flooding began. The fall of 1993 brought Delmar more work than he had ever handled. The wait-in list for casting work stretched to 6 weeks. He and Gary worked 6 days a week. Norma came in on Saturdays to handle the phone and the paperwork. The back room ran 2 pours a day when the schedule demanded it, which was more than Delmar had designed it for, and he had to rebuild the furnace lining twice that fall because the refractory brick was degrading faster than expected under the increased cycle count. And it was in the fall of 1993 that Wade Prescott came to see him. Let me tell you about that visit, because it's the part of the story that most people who know it remember best. Wade drove up in his truck on a Wednesday afternoon in October. Delmar was in the main shop, fitting a bearing housing he had just machined. Gary was in the back room doing a pour. Wade came through the front door, which was unusual. Most customers came around to the side entrance, and stood for a moment looking at the shop floor before he found Delmar at the lathe. He was wearing the same kind of clothes he always wore, a pressed shirt and clean work pants. The clothes of a man who worked around equipment without working on it. He looked, Delmar thought, like he had something he wanted to say and wasn't sure how to start. What he said, after a moment, was that he had a customer, a farmer named Ellis Rasmussen who ran 2,400 acres out past Zenith, a good customer of Wade's for 15 years, who had a 1966 John Deere 4020 with a cracked final drive housing. The housing was a large casting, a critical structural component, and the replacement part, which Wade had ordered through his normal channels, had a lead time of 14 weeks. Ellis needed the tractor for fall field work. He had asked Wade if there was anything that could be done. Wade had told him he would make some calls. He had made the calls. Nobody could help. And then, after a week of this, he had driven to Delmar's shop. He did not say he had been wrong about Delmar's work. He did not reference the things he had said at the co-op. He asked, with the directness of a man who has decided that the situation requires him to set aside something he'd prefer not to set aside, whether Delmar could cast a replacement final drive housing for a 4020. Delmar set down the bearing housing he had been fitting. He walked to the back room and looked at the pattern shelves for about 30 seconds. He came back out and told Wade he had a pattern for the 4020 final drive housing. He had made it in 1989 from a cracked housing that a farmer in Pratt County had been using as a boat anchor in his stock pond. He told Wade the part would take 3 weeks and would cost $160. Wade said that was fine. Delmar said he would need a deposit. Wade wrote him a check for $80 on the spot. Wade was almost to the door when Delmar said, without looking up from the workbench, that the reason the part would be ready in 3 weeks was because he had the pattern. He said he had the pattern because he had made it 4 years ago when the part was still available, because he had known that someday it wouldn't be. He said this without accusation, in the same tone he used to discuss metal temperatures and sand ratios. He was not twisting the knife. He was stating a fact that he believed Wade needed to understand. Wade stood at the door for a moment. Then he said he understood. Then he left. The final drive housing was ready in 18 days. Ellis Rasmussen installed it and ran the tractor through fall harvest without incident. The following spring, Wade Prescott began sending customers to Delmar for casting work on a regular basis. He did not advertise this arrangement. He did not make a public statement about it. He simply started giving people Delmar's phone number when they called about parts he couldn't source, which was, given the state of the agricultural parts supply chain in the mid-1990s, increasingly often. Let me tell you about the 15 years that followed, because they are the heart of the story and because most people who know Delmar Huber's name know it from those years without knowing how those years came to be. Between 1993 and 2002, the back room at Huber Machine and Repair cast and machined parts for agricultural equipment from 31 counties in Kansas, Oklahoma, and Nebraska. The parts ranged from small bracket castings worth $30 to complex transmission housings worth several hundred. The pattern library grew to over 1,400 patterns. Delmar added a second furnace. A larger induction unit he bought from a closed industrial foundry in Wichita in 1997, which allowed him to work with ductile iron in addition to gray iron, expanding the range of parts he could produce. He hired 2 more machinists and trained them both in foundry work. He sent Gary Hassel to a 3-day course on iron metallurgy at Kansas State in 1995, and Gary came back with a better understanding of the chemistry than Delmar had, and for the first time in their working relationship, Delmar found himself learning something from his employee, which he considered one of the better developments of that decade. The logbooks continued. By 2000, there were 47 of them. They documented every pour, every pattern modification, every alloy adjustment, every failure and its cause, and the correction applied. They were, by that point, something that a materials engineer would have recognized as a serious technical document, though no materials engineer had ever seen them. They lived on a shelf in the back room between the sand muller and the flask rack, accessible to anyone who worked there, consulted regularly, updated after every pour. Farmers drove to the shop from distances that would have seemed improbable in 1987. A man from Finney County, 200 miles west, drove his pickup to St. John in 1999 with a cracked gear housing from a 1952 case-vac tractor that had been in his family since new. He had been told by 4 different shops that the part was irreplaceable. He had heard about Delmar from a man at a farm auction in Garden City who had heard about him from a man in Pratt County who had gotten a water pump housing cast in 1991. The Finney County man's name was Orville Castillo, and he was 71 years old, and he told Delmar when he walked in that he had driven 200 miles on the chance that the story he'd heard was true, and he was prepared to be disappointed. Delmar looked at the housing for 2 minutes. He went to the pattern library. He came back with a pattern he had made in 1993 from a similar housing he'd found at a salvage yard in Pratt. He told Orville the part would be ready in 2 weeks. Orville sat down in the chair beside the front counter and appeared for a moment to be composing himself. Then he asked what the deposit was. Let me tell you about what Delmar built, because it deserves to be named clearly, even though Delmar himself never named it. What Delmar built between 1984 and 2002 was a repository, not a museum. A museum preserves things for observation. What Delmar built was a functioning archive, a place where the knowledge of how to make things that the industrial supply chain had decided were not worth making anymore was kept alive in the most direct possible way, by continuing to make them. The pattern library was the visible part of it, the part you could point to and count. But the real repository was the logbooks and the people who had been trained in the back room, and the accumulated understanding, built over 18 years of pours, of how iron behaves under the specific conditions of a small foundry in south-central Kansas. The humidity, the temperature swings, the particular sand available locally, the characteristics of the scrap iron that form the primary charge material. This knowledge was not written down in any single place. It was distributed across the logbooks and the patterns and the minds of the 4 people who worked in that room, and it existed nowhere else in the world. Wade Prescott understood this eventually. He understood it more clearly than almost anyone outside the shop, because he was the person who most often encountered the consequences of its existence. The customer who came to him in desperation and left for Delmar's shop and came back 3 weeks later with a working tractor. He had been wrong about Delmar in 1987, and he had known he was wrong since at least 1990, and he had spent the intervening years finding ways to be useful to the situation he had initially dismissed. He sent customers. He passed along information about parts that were being discontinued. He called Delmar once, in 1996, when a manufacturer's rep told him that a particular casting for a line of combines was going out of production, and he gave Delmar 6 months of warning, which was enough time for Delmar to get his hands on an original part and make a pattern before the last one disappeared from the supply chain. It was not an apology. Wade Prescott was not a man who apologized easily, and Delmar was not a man who required apologies. But it was something. It was a man who had been wrong making himself useful to the person he had been wrong about, which is sometimes the most honest form of acknowledgement available. Let me tell you about the morning in the fall of 2002, when Delmar told Gary Hassel he was thinking about retiring, because it's the moment when the story shifts from one generation to the next. Gary was 38 years old by then, and he had been working in the shop for 14 years, and he knew the back room as well as anyone alive except Delmar. He had been doing increasingly complex casting work for the past 5 years, the kind of work that required the accumulated judgment that only comes from having poured iron in the same room for a decade, from knowing how the furnace behaved in cold weather versus hot, from having made the same mistake 3 times and having learned from it 3 times. He had his own section of the logbooks by now, his own handwriting filling pages alongside Delmar's smaller script. When Delmar told him he was thinking about retiring, Gary didn't say much. He asked about the patterns. Delmar said the patterns would stay. He asked about the logbooks. Delmar said the logbooks would stay. He asked about the furnaces. Delmar said he was thinking about that. Then Gary asked whether Delmar had thought about what would happen to the knowledge. Not the patterns, not the logbooks, but the understanding that wasn't written down anywhere. The judgment that came from 18 years of watching iron cool and knowing from the color of the surface whether the pour had been right. Delmar looked at him for a moment and then said that was why he was telling Gary first. Delmar retired in the spring of 2003. He sold the business to Gary Hassel for a price that reflected what Gary could afford, rather than what the business was worth on paper, which was a considerable discount. He spent a month in the shop after the sale, not working, just available, answering questions, pointing to things in the logbooks, demonstrating pour techniques that were hard to describe in writing. Gary called him twice that first summer with questions about metallurgy, and Delmar answered both calls from the kitchen table at his house outside St. John, talking through the problem the way he had always talked through problems, methodically and without drama, until Gary had what he needed. The pattern library passed to Gary intact. All 1,400-plus patterns, cataloged in Delmar's handwriting in a series of 3-ring binders that Gary kept on the same shelf where Delmar had kept them. The logbooks passed to Gary intact. The furnaces, both of them, stayed in the back room. The cinder block wall with the steel door stayed. The sand muller stayed. The flask rack that Delmar had welded from angle iron in 1984 stayed, still functional, still in daily use. Let me tell you about what Gary Hassel did with what he inherited, because the story doesn't end with Delmar's retirement. Gary ran the shop for 11 years before his own son, a young man named Caleb Hassel, who had grown up listening to foundry talk at the dinner table and had gone to Kansas State for mechanical engineering and come back with a degree and a head full of ideas about metallurgy that Gary found simultaneously impressive and slightly alarming, joined the business. Caleb had taken a course in 3D scanning and digital pattern making and had come home from Manhattan with a proposal. He wanted to digitize the entire pattern library, not replace the physical patterns. He understood their value, but create digital backups, 3-dimensional scans of every pattern, so that if a pattern was damaged or destroyed, it could be reproduced. He also wanted to use the digital files to make patterns for parts that Delmar had never gotten to, parts that were still in the supply chain but that Caleb could see, looking at the same trends Delmar had looked at in 1984, were heading toward discontinuation. Gary listened to the proposal at the kitchen table, in the same kitchen where Delmar had once sat with his own coffee and his own thoughts about what was coming. He asked a few questions. He looked at the cost estimates Caleb had put together. He thought about it for a week. Then he told Caleb yes. The digitization project took 2 years. Caleb scanned every pattern in the library, built a searchable digital catalog, and added 200 new patterns for parts that the digital research had flagged as likely discontinuation candidates. He also, in the process of handling every pattern in the library, read the logbooks cover to cover, all 47 of them, plus the additional volumes Gary had added, and wrote a summary document that organized the accumulated metallurgical knowledge into a form that could be taught to someone who hadn't spent years in the back room. Delmar read the summary document and called Gary to say that Caleb had gotten it mostly right and that there were 2 things he'd gotten slightly wrong, and Gary should have Caleb call him so they could fix them. Caleb called Delmar that evening. They talked for 2 hours. Delmar was 74 years old, and his memory for pour temperatures and sand ratios was, Caleb told his father afterward, completely intact. Let me tell you one last thing. because the story has a closing that deserves to be told straight. Wade Prescott retired from the John Deere dealership in 1998 and sold the business to a regional dealer group from Wichita. He died in 2007 at the age of 71. His obituary in the St. John paper mentioned his years of service to the agricultural community of Stafford County, and his reputation for fair dealing, and his membership in the Methodist Church and the Rotary Club. It did not mention Delmar Huber. But the people who read it, and who knew both men, understood that the relationship between them, the long, complicated, ultimately useful relationship between the man who had laughed at the back room and the man who had built it, was part of what the county had been during those years, part of what had kept it working when the supply chain failed and the casting plant closed and the parts stopped coming. Delmar Huber is 95 years old as of this telling. He lives in the same house outside St. John where he has lived since 1967. He does not go to the shop anymore, but Gary Hassel calls him when something comes up that the logbooks don't fully answer, and Delmar answers the phone and talks through the problem, and the answer is usually right. The pattern library now holds over 1,600 patterns, physical and digital. The logbooks now fill 2 shelves. The flask rack Delmar welded in 1984 is still in the back room, still in use, though it has been repaired twice and is held together in one corner by a weld bead that Caleb laid down with a MIG welder in 2019, and that Delmar, when he saw a photograph of it, said was adequate. The 1,400 original patterns that Delmar made and collected between 1984 and 2003 are preserved in a climate-controlled storage room that Caleb built into the back of the shop in 2021. Some of the wooden ones are showing their age. The pine shrinks and swells with the seasons, and a few have developed small cracks in the thin sections. But none have been discarded, and none will be. They are maintained the way the shop has always maintained things, not as artifacts, not as decoration, but as tools, as working documents of a knowledge that has no other home. Somewhere in Finney County, Orville Castillo's 1952 Case Vassie is still running. His grandson farms the same ground now, and the tractor is still in the equipment line, still used for light work around the farmstead, still wearing the gear housing that Delmar cast from a pattern he'd made from a salvage yard part on a Tuesday afternoon in 1993, because it had interested him and he'd thought he might need it someday. That's what happens when a man builds something not because someone asked him to, but because he could see what was coming and decided that knowledge was worth keeping. That's what happens when the thing everyone else is throwing away is the thing that turns out to matter. That's what happens when a man spends 18 years in a cinder block room paying attention to what the iron is telling him, and writing it down, and building the patterns, and waiting for the day when the people who laughed at the back room need what's in it. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to remember why they were.